Neptune Township is a good candidate for the application of an advanced microgrid, largely because Jersey Shore Medical Center is a trauma center that already has 24-hour capability and emergency generation and some cogeneration assets. So with Jersey Shore Medical Center, number one, as a trauma center with substantial emergency operation capabilities existing, and combined with Neptune's proximity to the Jersey coast and orientation to major evacuation routes, that made Neptune Township a candidate from the high-level planning standpoint. Our initial review and evaluation of Neptune for application of the microgrid was really limited initially to about a half-mile done in radius, which was recommended not only from past experience and other microgrid projects, but it was some guidance that we received both from the BPU and from former studies that were done in New Jersey. Our look within the first half-mile radius identified multiple facilities with multiple FEMA classifications that can serve a multitude of support services for residents, travelers, visitors, and first responders and emergency support personnel. So a lot of those facilities are in proximity to each other, and some of the facilities are actually in close proximity and contiguous to Jersey Shore Medical Center. The township specifically, Office of Emergency Management, police station, high school are in proximity to Jersey Shore Medical Center and have some existing utility infrastructure interconnectability. Looking beyond the half-mile radius and recommended distance for microgrid, we wanted to see if there were opportunities for services and sheltering in place beyond the half-mile. We know a half-mile radius is a rule of thumb, but it's not a hard and fast limit necessarily. A lot of it depends on what that geography is like. It also depends upon facilities and potential services that might be available slightly beyond the half-mile radius. And that's exactly what we found in Neptune's case. When we looked beyond that half-mile radius, we picked up some potentially valuable stakeholders like a pharmacy, a gas station. There's a senior center slightly outside of the half-mile radius, the post office. The post office has a tremendous amount of logistical support and opportunity in a black sky event. If needed, postal service can be used to deliver supplies and things like that. So it's a great find and a great potential stakeholder to identify slightly outside of the half-mile radius. Food stores and medical supply. I mean, there's a significant number of facilities that can add services and support in a black sky event that we felt were certainly worth including. And so when we found those facilities and we found those opportunities, we knew that the project could potentially grow beyond that half-mile radius, but we were not for sure. We're not sure how regulatory changes and assistance is going to work. So we came up with multiple scenarios in multiple areas in our particular application, so we can very easily add or subtract areas and facilities and services based on need, based on financial modeling, and based on geography. So we have an area A, an area B, and even further out, we have an area C. Area C is something that a potential microgrid candidate may or may not contemplate. It really depends on circumstances and what could potentially be worth extending beyond the half-mile and beyond the half-mile plus radius, because cost and justification is a different challenge in that regard. In this particular case, in the case of Neptune Township, the outliers, the potential stakeholders that we are contemplating including in the microgrid are of the highest value in terms of a long-term managed and sustainable resource for emergency services, for long-term total emergency utility services. So when we look at Area C in the case of Neptune Township, we wouldn't ordinarily look at facilities as far away as they are in Area C. However, those facilities include the potable water treatment facility for Neptune Township, including Jersey Shore Medical Center, the Municipal Utilities Authority, which manages wastewater and sewage from Neptune and the surrounding areas, a fire company, a first aid station, there's a cell tower, really, really critical pieces of infrastructure in the time of emergency. And quite frankly, we're in the process of planning implementation in Neptune, and we're not sure exactly how it's going to work with Area C. But surely in the study, these are the types of facilities and these are the types of challenges you want to identify and document right away, so you have a real good handle on how your microgrid and your emergency services are ultimately going to work. So it's important to understand how the advanced microgrid will ultimately operate within a particular municipality. Conceptually, in most cases, we anticipate advanced microgrids ultimately being managed and operated by, in part, a municipal utility or utilities authority, some public acting contracting agency that will coordinate the necessary private partners and operators and potential owners of various assets, stakeholders. They'll coordinate and act as a central clearinghouse to handle things like contracting and maintenance and operations, and ultimately act as a utility representative to the stakeholders. The microgrid will operate under blue sky conditions, which is what we call normal conditions, non-emergency, and the microgrid will be completely undetectable to anybody, whether they're a stakeholder, a visitor, occupant, student, completely undetectable. Operates exactly like the existing utility infrastructure at the point of use. So it's completely undetectable. Under a black sky condition, what we have come to know as an emergency condition, when under ordinary conditions, under ordinary arrangements and configurations, the centralized utility would be inoperable. So a hurricane, a bad snowstorm, power lines are down, perhaps there's an interruption to natural gas supply. That would something we would consider to be a black sky event. Black sky event, the microgrid will ultimately decouple from the centralized utility system and power just the stakeholder group inside of the cluster, whether it be A, B, or C, or A, B, and C in the case of Neptune. When that happens, it's important for microgrid planners to understand that in this particular case, Neptune Township will likely be one of the very few areas that has a substantial amount of human and emergency services readily available. Dry beds, hot showers, hot meals, steady flow of medicine and medical support. And what we have contemplated and we understand is that the surrounding areas will almost certainly gravitate toward Neptune as the black sky condition continues on. We start contemplating longer term black sky conditions, 4 and 5 day power outages, fuel, medicine, food, water, things like basic necessities start to become difficult to access. And it's reasonable to expect, and we have contemplated, that the surrounding areas, surrounding residents who have not sought shelter elsewhere and who have not evacuated or have returned from a short-term evacuation or shelter will ultimately gravitate toward Neptune and the safety and comfort of full utility service. We think that's a good thing, and we want Neptune and the services to be there and available for everyone. However, flow of people who require services and the availability of services and the availability of people to manage those services needs to be balanced. More importantly, it needs to be planned and it needs to be considered and accommodated. We're not at all suggesting that in this case, Neptune Township and the Neptune Township microgrid stakeholders would somehow be responsible to feed the rest of the state. However, it would not be realistic to expect that there won't be a significant influx of people who are looking for assistance and comfort. So we want to make sure that town centers and entities who contemplate microgrids have a very, very firm grasp on OEM, interlocal services agreements. It's a very, very good time to make sure that you're working cooperatively on paper as well as logistically with local first responders. I know we know one experience that there's some horse trading that happens between public agencies and entities for services and assistance, especially first responders. But it requires some accounting because it's very easy to start to tax one particular service and perhaps leave resources on the table at another. So it's something that needs to be done in an organized way. We want to make sure that the services that are provided, the vital sheltering opportunities that microgrids provide, remain sustainable, manageable, and helpful to the greatest number of people. We certainly don't want them compromised. There are a few fundamental elements of microgrid planning that will ultimately materialize in an action list for a contracting agency that's pursuing the potential implementation of a microgrid. And that action list will have items and recommendations that apply whether the microgrid is implemented or not. When the microgrid study is ultimately completed, it's going to include a list of recommendations to have all of the stakeholder facilities and contracting matters and accounts, utility accounts, rights of way, leases, things like that. Those types of things really need to be accounted for and need to be identified and planned for good order. Specifically, the facilities will be evaluated for their present level of operating efficiency, the lighting systems, the heating systems, the air conditioning equipment and ventilation equipment. That will certainly be evaluated, and recommendations will be made with regard to low cost, no cost, and incentivized improvements and efficiency upgrades to make sure that those stakeholder facilities that will ultimately be part of the microgrid will be as efficient as they practically can be within reason and within practical means. That approach is going to rely heavily on state and local utility incentives to offset upfront costs for things like lighting fixture upgrades and system upgrades and things of this nature. The other thing is also the application of energy storage and energy generation assets. All of the facilities and all of the loads and all of the dynamic energy consumption behavior that occurs between these stakeholders will ultimately be analyzed in the first phase study and will be evaluated for how they can ultimately contribute to hosting particular generation sources, storage sources, control sources, and things of this nature. Those recommendations might make sense financially and might ultimately benefit the host facility, whether the microgrid gets built or not. For example, solar is a great example. There's recent legislation that has been signed by the governor of New Jersey, and it makes a solar program fairly attractive and more than likely financeable. So all of the stakeholder facilities we evaluated ultimately get considered for solar. And obviously, if a microgrid moves forward, solar integration would be a part of that where it makes sense. If the microgrid doesn't move forward, then obviously that solar application may still make sense and be bankable and financeable. So when items are evaluated and the facilities are included and the study is concluded, there's information in the process that is usable, and that action list is something that all of the stakeholders will ultimately be able to take something away and either implement as a whole, as a group, or if the microgrid, for whatever reason, doesn't move forward, can certainly move forward with on their own. In that same concept, we recommend that public agencies and like agencies, for example, firehouses that might be not-for-profit or not-for-profit, first aid stations that who have a history of working with the municipality and local contracting unit, it's very utility. You're in a local services agreement or whatever instrument of shared services really makes it official. It's really important to have those things in order, along with utility data, utility information. It's critically important that municipalities and public contracting units and stakeholder groups retain and manage their utility bills on a monthly basis. It is absolutely important that utility billing information is readily available to a multitude of consultants, contractors, and partners going forward with these types of projects. And it is a very, very important part of this as well. In fact, in many, many cases, at the end of a study of this nature, it may be recommended that the stakeholder group aggregate their electric and natural gas in a buying group and secure contracts for fixed pricing going forward, so electric and natural gas loads can ultimately be managed into the microgrid the most efficient way. And obviously that gets very, very detailed at the end of the study, and there's a very, very direct prescriptive recommendation for how to implement that kind of a thing. But it will certainly depend on each public contracting unit, each stakeholder, and what they have to do to satisfy various procurement requirements. But we generally make that kind of recommendation. Facility drawings, rights of way, easements, land leases, things like this. These are roof warranties. This kind of technical information and documentation is critically important to planning and quite frankly, closing, because ultimately the microgrid will be financed and all of this paperwork, documentation will be required for record and best practices. So it's really important to keep things up to date, keep things loose, organized, and on hand. The next thing to consider, and we ultimately want to include in implementation, is procurement. Procurement of professionals and implementation teams. It's important to use a thorough and productive process to procure professionals and implementation teams. And it will really depend on the public contracting unit and stakeholder group as to how best to procure and what method of procurement to use. However, it's generally the case that an implementation like this would be heavily based on qualification and experience rather than necessarily the absolute lowest cost. Wouldn't necessarily recommend anything like a low bid. This is something that should be done through an RFQ and an RFP, that perhaps, maybe even a redevelopment agreement. There's a multitude of mechanisms that can facilitate contracting, but it's something that really needs to be considered because, the study and the implementation has to be done by a capable team. And there are not that many. So it's important to get the greatest amount of competition, but it's also important to get the appropriate competitors.